You are re-gened. You get a new gene code. You're a new person. Regenerated. That'll preach right there. So, the evolutionists believe that this first life form, whenever it was, 3.9 billion years ago, found somebody to marry. Now, just hold on a second. Going from non-living material to living material is a giant step. And then going from something that's alive to something that's able to reproduce is another gigantic step. Those are just brushed over in the textbooks as if, well, it must have happened because here we are. I asked an evolutionist in a debate, can you please explain how do we get from just living organisms to sexual reproduction in living organisms? And he said, well, it's a much more efficient system because it mixes the genes of the mother and the father. Well, because it's a better system doesn't explain how it got here, does it? That's not an explanation. And if you read the critics on the website that criticize me, their answers are hilarious. Somehow they think because I talked, I answered the question. I had students like that when I was in school. You ask them an essay question, they could write 6 pages and not say a word. How many of you have done that to your teacher yourself, okay? When you don't know the answer, you blitz them with a lot of words, right? Eric, you did that a few times, I'm sure, right? Been there, done that. Read through the scoffers' letters and their answers, and it's just like they're just blowing. They're not answering. They're just saying to hear themselves. They're just talking to hear themselves talk, and it's hilarious. So when somebody says, where did Cain get a wife and who did Seth marry? I first point out the folly of what they believe. And now the problem I have looks very small. Let's put it in perspective. Compared to your problem, everything came from a rock. And that's an expression that drives them nuts. I use that all the time. I asked the guy last debate I was in wherever it was, a couple weeks ago. I said, would you please just answer a question for me? Do you believe we came from a rock? He talked for 5 or 10 minutes, did not answer the question. I said, well, thank you for all that stuff you said, but would you please answer my question now? I just want a yes or no. Do you believe we came from a rock? He went off and talked for 10 or 15 more minutes, you know. I said, oh, that's interesting. Now, let's go back to the question. Do you believe we came from a rock? Finally, he said, yes, I do. That's all I want to know. Why did it take you 20 minutes to tell me that? Just admit it. If you believe we came from a rock, that's fine. Be proud of it. You know, put a rock in a picture frame. Great, 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 great grandpa. Family tree. Make a slide. Yes, there's great, 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 great grandpa. The Bible teaches, and we'll take a break after this, Adam lived after he begat Seth 800 years and begat sons and daughters. Now tell me, how many kids could you have in 800 years? Several, right? So, in the first generation, they married sisters. Here's my reasons I give, and you might want to learn these reasons. This would be a good quiz question, too. This stops them every time. They had to marry sisters. In the first place, there's no other choice. I mean, isn't that an obvious answer? There's nobody else available. Secondly, who would you report them to? You going to turn them into the police? Well, the policeman married his sister, too. I mean, that's all there is, you know. Nobody would have thought anything about it, would they? It's normal. Today, of course, you know, the idea of marrying sisters, oh, wow, it's horrible, it's terrible. Well, somebody's going to marry your sister, and they're going to think it's great. You probably married somebody's sister, right? So, there's no other choice. They would not have thought it's wrong. That could be actually 2 answers. You wouldn't have anybody to report them to. Thirdly, there were no laws against it. Atheists get all upset and say, well, that's incest and that's against the law. Well, now, wait a minute. When was that law given? Moses gave the law right here, 1500 B.C., roughly, when Moses lived. That's well after the creation. Now, in almost every country, they have a legal concept. We call it ex post facto here in America. You cannot pass a law and then fine somebody for breaking the law before it was passed. Let's suppose you're out spitting on the sidewalk and somebody says that we ought to make a law about that. Okay, so they pass a law, you can't spit on the sidewalk. Then they come arrest you because you did it last week. Ex post facto. It's a Latin for something. I don't know what it is, but it means after the fact. You can't pass a law and fine somebody for something they did before the law was in effect. And that's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to say, see, it's against the law to marry sisters. Cain married his sister, therefore he broke the law. Well, you numbskull. Think about it, okay? There weren't any laws against it. See, they didn't need any laws against it. When the race was pure, there were no defective genes, no defective chromosomes. You would not have any deformed children. Everything about you is inherited. Even having children is hereditary. If your parents don't have any, you won't either. That's been proven in laboratory tests, folks. So there's not a problem at all. See, the average human being, you have 46 chromosomes, and a chromosome, if you took a ladder about from here to Chicago, that'd be a long ladder, and you twisted it up, just start twisting the end, make it like a corkscrew. Each of the rungs of the ladder is called a gene. The entire ladder is called a chromosome. It's called the double helix, and it gets pretty complicated in biology, but basically, you got this long ladder that's twisted up. Each of the rungs of the ladder is a gene. You can look up chromosome in any biology textbook, and it'll show you one of these pictures. Each of these genes does different things. You've probably got a whole section right here of the gene code that's going to determine what color hair you have. It's like the code in a computer. It's a computer code, okay? Now, when you get married, you and the husband or wife are going to each contribute half of a chromosome to the baby. It is absolutely beyond comprehension that you can get a ladder from here to Chicago that's twisted. It breaks in half all the way down the middle, unwinds itself, finds the one coming from the husband or wife, and winds itself back together. 46 of them. Incredible. There isn't anybody on the planet who has a clue how this can happen. When this ladder gets back together, suppose you have contributed genetic information for blonde hair. Your wife has contributed a section of genetic information for red hair. One of those is going to be dominant, and the kid's going to be born with whichever is the most dominant. And you get into Mendel's laws of, dominant genes and recessive genes and all that kind of stuff. But there is scientists estimate that probably of the billions of genes you have, about 3,500 of them are defective. You got about 3,500 defective genes in your gene pool. And 3,500 out of billions is insignificant. Okay, it's a 0.00001% or something like that. It's a very small number. But if you marry somebody who's very closely related to you, like a first cousin, or a niece, or your aunt, there is a good chance that the same defective genes exist in her that exist in you, and so you probably will have something deformed on the child. Which is why, in almost every state, it is against the law to marry closer than a first cousin. I believe 3 states still allow first cousin marriages. Almost all states, it has to be at least a second cousin or farther distant related, because you're going to probably end up with something deformed. Either low IQ. Now, what happened in Europe years ago, they had to marry royalty. Well, sometimes the only royalty available is your sister. And since they want to pass on the royal line, they would marry their sister or their aunt or their niece or their first cousin. And they ended up with some strange things. 6 fingers was very common. One of the queens, I think it was a queen of Europe or England or something, had special dresses designed with a V coming down to cover her hand because she had 6 fingers and was embarrassed by it. All of her dresses had long sleeves with a V coming down. Some of the kings died of hemophilia. Hemophiliacs, they bleed to death. You cut them a little bit and they bleed. You bruise them and they bleed internally, bleed to death. That's hemophilia. That's oftentimes from inbreeding. We had a little girl that rode our bus in Illinois when I drove a bus up there, at a church bus. Her mother and her father were brother and sister. 9-year-old boy raped